Welcome to Strong Mind Stories, where we explore real human strength, the kind that comes from overcoming mental battles, life setbacks, and the challenges that try to break us. If that speaks to you, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story. I actually read every comment, so drop your thoughts below, and if you have a story idea or a challenge you'd love to see explored, I want to hear it. Let's get into today's story. The Middle Distance. Jimmy sat in the mess hall, picking at his food while the usual chaos swirled around him. Across the table, Corporal Davis was giving Private Del Campo hell about a missed shot during morning drills. Stevie Wonder could have made that shot, Del Campo. What the hell were you aiming at, the moon? The table erupted in laughter. Del Campo grinned, flipped Davis off. Yeah? Well, at least I don't need a stepladder to reach my locker, you short stack. And Jimmy, we're going to have to call you the Snailinator. Any longer between shots, and we might have to take a nap. More laughter. Standard military banter, harmless as breathing. But Jimmy felt it like a knife between his ribs. The room tilted. Suddenly, he wasn't 32. He was 11, sitting at a dinner table while his older brother Danny made fun of his drawing. What is that supposed to be, a horse? Looks like a dog got hit by a truck. Everyone laughing. His father not looking up from his plate. His mother already moving to the kitchen, too tired to mediate, too overwhelmed to notice the way Jimmy's face went hot, the way something inside him curled up and died a little. I want to disappear. I want to stop existing. Hayes? You good? Jimmy blinked. Davis was looking at him. Yeah, fine. But he wasn't fine. The depression rolled over him like a wave. That familiar void opening up in his chest. The certainty that he didn't belong here, had never belonged anywhere, would be better off just gone. He stood abruptly, dumped his tray, walked out. Behind him, he heard Davis mutter, "What's his problem?" Jimmy found himself in the empty rec room, hands shaking, chest tight. The flashback wasn't finished with him yet. 12 years old. Saturday afternoon. His older siblings were out. Danny at basketball practice, Sarah at a friend's house. Katie was napping. The house was quiet in that rare way that should have felt peaceful, but instead felt like abandonment. Jimmy sat in the living room. Math homework spread on the coffee table. He'd been stuck on the same problem for 20 minutes. The numbers wouldn't make sense, kept sliding around in his head like oil on water. His mother was in the kitchen, doing dishes. He could hear the water running, plates clinking. He wanted to ask for help. The words were right there in his throat. But asking meant interrupting her. Meant adding one more thing to her already exhausted day. Meant being a burden when he should be the easy one, the quiet one, the one who didn't need anything. So he sat there, staring at the numbers, feeling stupid and small and utterly alone. The house around him full of people but empty of anyone who saw him, who noticed he was struggling, who cared enough to ask if he was okay. He'd felt it then, that hollow ache in his chest, the certainty that if he disappeared, if he simply ceased to exist, no one would really notice. They'd grieve, probably, in that abstract way you grieve something you never quite had. But their daily lives wouldn't change. The math would go unfinished. The room would stay quiet. Everything would continue exactly as it had. And somehow that was worse than being actively rejected. At least rejection meant you'd been seen first. Jimmy pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to stop the spiral. But the feeling was there now, fully activated, that ancient childhood conviction that his existence was optional, that the world would function just fine, maybe better, without him taking up space in it. His therapist, Dr. Patel, had explained it. Emotional flashbacks didn't always come with visual memories. Sometimes they were just feelings, pure, distilled pain from childhood flooding his adult nervous system. The body remembering what the mind tried to forget. And right now, his body remembered everything. The isolation, the invisibility, the desperate, aching need to matter to someone, anyone, coupled with the bone-deep certainty that he never would. That he was fundamentally unworthy of attention, of care, of love. The pain of it was physical. A crushing weight on his chest, a tightness in his throat, a numbness spreading through his limbs. His mind screamed for escape, sleep, unconsciousness, anything to stop feeling this. The part of him that had learned to survive by disappearing wanted nothing more than to shut down completely. To stop existing, even temporarily, because existing hurt too much. Just make it stop. Please. I can't do this. I can't feel this. But he was sitting in a rec room on a military base, and there was no escape. No way to shut down without people noticing, asking questions, seeing the brokenness he'd spent his whole life trying to hide. So he sat there, breathing through it, hands clenched into fists, waiting for the flashback to release him. 3 weeks since the diagnosis. Complex PTSD from emotional neglect. For kids, two overwhelmed parents, and him in the middle, quiet, easy, invisible. His father's father had survived the depression by becoming granite. Love was a luxury, providing was everything. His father had learned that lesson well. Worked himself hollow trying to keep 4 kids fed and clothed while his own emotional needs went unacknowledged, unprocessed, passed along like toxic inheritance. His mother's mother had been a drunk, divorced when that still meant scandal, teaching her daughter that emotional needs were burdens no one wanted to carry. His mother had tried. God, she'd tried. But with 4 kids and no roadmap for how to actually be present, trying wasn't enough. The third child, old enough to not need constant care, young enough to not be taken seriously, the one who learned to disappear. Dr. Patel had given him the mantra, I am not a victim. I am not worthless. I am not damaged. I take control. I am the man I need to be. Jimmy read it every day. It felt like trying to convince himself the sky was green. The next trigger came during a patrol brief. Lieutenant Morrison was going over assignments, and Sergeant Williams made a crack about Jimmy's map reading. Hayes reads maps like my grandmother drives, slow and turned around backwards. Chuckles around the room. Williams grinned, not cruel, just the usual razzying. But Jimmy felt his throat close. The shame was instant and total, that childhood certainty flooding back. You're not good enough. You're the problem. Everyone sees it. He forced himself to nod, to smile, but inside he was drowning. The rest of the brief washed over him in waves of static. When it ended, he found himself in the latrine, gripping the sink, staring at his reflection. The face looking back at him was a stranger's. Hollow-eyed, gray. The face of someone who'd been holding his breath for 32 years. Just stop existing. It would be easier for everyone. The thought came so naturally, had lived in him so long, he almost didn't recognize it as the wound it was. The flashback was building again. He could feel it gathering like a storm. That crushing sensation in his chest, the tightness spreading through his body, the overwhelming need to escape his own skin. When the emotional flashback hit full force, it wasn't a memory. It was a state of being. His 12-year-old self and his 32-year-old self collapsed into the same moment, the same pain, the same desperate certainty that he was fundamentally wrong. That his existence was a mistake no one knew how to correct. The walls of the latrine felt too close. The fluorescent lights too bright. His own reflection too present, too solid, too inescapably there when all he wanted was to dissolve. To stop taking up space. To stop being a burden that people had to notice and comment on and criticize. His hands gripped the porcelain sink so hard his knuckles went white. Inside his head, a voice, his own voice, but younger, smaller, desperate, was screaming for it all to stop. Screaming for the pain of existing to just end. Not death, exactly, though that would work. Just non-existence. The absence of feeling. The relief of finally not having to try so hard to be a person. He wanted to shut down. Wanted his brain to just stop processing, stop feeling, stop cataloging all the ways he didn't measure up. Wanted the mercy of numbness, of dissociation, of that floating distance where nothing could touch him. But he couldn't. Not here. Not where people could see. So he stood there, white-knuckling the sink, riding out the wave of pain that had no source he could point to and say there, that's what hurts. Just the accumulated weight of 32 years of feeling invisible, optional, wrong. After several minutes, or maybe hours, time was strange in flashbacks. The intensity began to fade. Not gone, just bearable. Enough that he could breathe normally, could splash water on his face, could walk back out into the world and pretend he was fine. Always pretending, always performing, always hiding the gaping wound where a sense of self should be. He tried calling home. Maybe talking to his mother would help, would give him some perspective. She answered on the third ring. Jimmy, honey, we haven't heard from you in forever. Are you eating enough? You know you get too thin when, Mom, I'm in therapy, working through some stuff. A pause. Therapy? Honey, what for? Is it the war? Your father's cousin did 2 tours in Vietnam, and he turned out just fine. It's not the war, Mom. It's childhood stuff. Growing up, Childhood. Her voice sharpened slightly. Jimmy, you had a good childhood. We gave you everything we could. There were 4 of you, you know. It wasn't easy, but I know you did your best. Then I don't understand what there is to work through. We fed you, clothed you, got you all through school. Your father worked himself to death. I was run ragged every single day. It's not about perfect, Mom. It's about, how did he explain the quiet wound of invisibility? I felt overlooked, like I didn't matter. Oh, Jimmy. Her tone was exasperated now, the way it used to get when he'd ask for something at the wrong time. You always were so sensitive. You know we loved you. We loved all of you. You were always the quiet boy, kept to himself. Danny and Sarah and Katie managed just fine. The words hit like shrapnel. You chose to feel invisible. I have to go, Mom. Well, all right. But honestly, this therapy thing, don't you think you're dwelling on things? Your father always said the best thing is to just move forward, not pick at old. He hung up. The darkness came then, complete and suffocating. That old certainty. She's right. You're being dramatic. Weak. You should just shut up and disappear like you always have. The flashback this time was worse than the others. Maybe because his mother's voice had triggered something primal, that specific flavor of dismissal he'd heard his whole childhood. The casual way she'd confirmed everything he'd always believed, that his pain wasn't real, wasn't valid, was just him being too sensitive. Jimmy sat on his bunk, unable to move. The weight on his chest was unbearable. Every breath felt like dragging concrete into his lungs. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, the edges going gray and fuzzy. Inside his head, he was 8 years old again. Birthday party. His 8th birthday. His mother had made a cake, invited kids from school. Jimmy had been excited, rare feeling, excitement. Dangerous feeling. Because excitement meant expectation, and expectation meant the possibility of disappointment. The kids had come, played in the backyard. His mother had been distracted, trying to manage Katie, who was 2 and fussy. His father at work. Danny and Sarah off with their own friends. And Jimmy, standing in his own backyard at his own birthday party, had felt utterly alone. The kids weren't mean, just not particularly interested. They'd come because their parents made them, would leave the second it was polite. He'd stood there, holding a paper plate with a slice of his own birthday cake, watching other kids play, feeling the terrible certainty that he could disappear right now and no one would notice. That he could walk into the house, into his room, cease to exist, and the party would continue without missing a beat. The pain of that realization, at 8 years old, on his birthday, had been staggering. Not the dramatic pain of abuse or abandonment, just the quiet, crushing pain of being fundamentally unimportant, of mattering so little that even on the one day supposed to be about you, you were still just background noise. Now, 24 years later, sitting on a bunk in a military base thousands of miles from that backyard, Jimmy felt that same pain with the same intensity. Time had done nothing to dull it. The wound was as fresh as it had ever been. And the worst part, the part that made him want to claw his way out of his own skin, was that there was no escape from it. No way to outrun a feeling that lived inside him. No amount of achievement or distance or time that would make it stop. He was trapped inside himself with this pain, and the only relief he could imagine was the permanent kind. Just make it stop. Please. I can't carry this anymore. I'm so tired of carrying this. But Del Campo needed him. The mission needed him. Some part of him, buried deep beneath the pain, still had a job to do. So he sat there, riding it out, waiting for the flashback to release its grip. 2 days later, the call came. The anti-fascist brigade was pushing through the eastern checkpoint. All units mobilize. Jimmy moved mechanically, gearing up, the depression still thick in his chest. Maybe today would be the day. Maybe a bullet would solve the problem his existence had always been. The convoy rolled out at dawn, 6 vehicles heading toward the contested zone. Jimmy rode in the 3rd truck, watching the landscape blur past, his mind somewhere else entirely. The mantra card sat in his pocket, untouched. What was the point? The firefight erupted without warning. The lead vehicle detonated a buried IED, flipping sideways in a ball of flame and smoke. Before Jimmy could process it, automatic weapons fire raked the convoy from both sides. The anti-fascist brigade had set up a perfect ambush, elevated positions on the ridgeline, crossfire, nowhere to run. Dismount. Dismount. Lieutenant Morrison was screaming. Jimmy threw himself out of the truck, landing hard behind the engine block as rounds punched through metal. The sound was deafening. Rifle fire, RPGs, someone screaming for a medic. He pressed himself against the tire, returning fire at muzzle flashes in the rocks. But his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his weapon. Just stand up. Make it quick. End it. The darkness whispered promises. One bullet. It would look like bad luck. No one would have to know it was what he'd wanted all along. Del Campo's hit. Davis's voice, high and panicked. Del Campo's down. Jimmy risked a look. 50 meters of open ground between the vehicles. Del Campo was sprawled in the dirt, clutching his leg, blood spreading dark across his fatigues. He'd been moving between positions when a round caught him. Now he was exposed, and the enemy fire was intensifying. I can't get to him. Davis was pinned behind the second vehicle, rounds sparking off the metal inches from his head. Williams. Can you? Negative. Williams was too far back, couldn't reach him without crossing even more open ground. Del Campo was screaming. The sound cut through everything. Raw. Terrified. The sound of a man watching himself bleed out. Jimmy watched from behind the tire. Watched Del Campo's blood pooling in the dust. Watched the brigade fighters adjusting their aim, tightening the noose. Not your problem. Let someone else handle it. You're worthless anyway. What difference does it make if you live or die? But Del Campo was still screaming. Jimmy's hand found the card in his pocket. He pulled it out with trembling fingers, had to squint to read it through the dust and smoke. I am not a victim. I am not worthless. I am not damaged. I take control. I am the man I need to be. The words felt like lies written in a language he didn't speak. But Del Campo was dying. Dr. Patel's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes we have to act our way into new thinking. Go, you worthless waste of space, Jimmy whispered, willing his legs to move. Then louder. You can do this. Then louder. Be a man. He shoved the card back in his pocket, checked his magazine, and looked at the 50 meters of hell between him and Del Campo. Rounds were still snapping through the air. RPGs were detonating against the vehicles. This was suicide. Good, the darkness whispered. Finally end it. But another voice, smaller, newer, barely audible over the gunfire, whispered something else. Not like this. Not today. Covering fire. Jimmy screamed. Davis, Williams, on my mark. Hayes, what are you? Davis started. 3, 2, 1. Now. Jimmy vaulted over the tire as Davis and Williams opened up, their rifles hammering at the ridgeline. He sprinted into the open, legs pumping, head down, and the world became nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat and the crack, crack, crack of rounds cutting the air around him. 20 meters. A bullet snapped past his ear close enough to feel the heat. I am not a victim. 30 meters. Something tugged at his sleeve, through his shirt, not his skin, close enough. I am not worthless. 40 meters. Del Campo was crying, trying to crawl, leaving a trail of blood. Hayes. Hayes. I am not damaged. Jimmy hit the ground sliding, baseball style, skidding into Del Campo in a cloud of dust. I got you. I got you. My leg. I can't feel. Del Campo's face was white, shock setting in. Stay with me. Jimmy grabbed Del Campo under the arms, started dragging him backwards. The kid weighed a ton with all his gear. Jimmy's boots scrabbled for purchase in the loose dirt. A round hit the ground 6 inches from his hand, spraying his face with grit. Go, go, go. Davis was still firing, but his voice was panicked. They're zeroing in. Jimmy pulled harder, his muscles screaming. 10 meters back, toward the vehicles. Del Campo was crying, dead weight, trying to help, but barely conscious. You're okay. You're okay. Just hold on. Jimmy was babbling, didn't even know he was talking. 20 meters. Almost there. He could see Williams moving, ready to grab them. Then Jimmy felt the impact. Something hit his plate carrier like a sledgehammer, right over his chest, knocked the air out of his lungs. He went down hard, still holding Del Campo, both of them sprawling in the dirt. This is it. This is how it ends. But he could breathe, could move. The round had hit his vest, no penetration. The ceramic plate had caught it. Move. Williams was there, grabbing Del Campo, hauling him back behind cover. Davis appeared next to Jimmy, hands under his arms. Can you run? Jimmy nodded, couldn't speak, and then they were running and falling behind the vehicle, and Williams had the medic kit out, and Del Campo was still alive, still crying, and Jimmy was pressed against the tire trying to remember how to breathe. "You crazy son of a bitch." Davis was staring at him like he'd grown a second head. You just ran out there. 50 meters of open ground." Jimmy looked down at his chest. The impact point was clearly visible, the fabric torn, the plate beneath cracked. Center mass. A kill shot that his equipment had barely stopped. His hands were shaking worse now than before. The adrenaline was crashing through him in waves. But something else was there too, something he couldn't name. He'd pushed through the darkness. It had screamed at him to quit, to die, to stop existing, and he'd told it no. Not today. The firefight continued for another 20 minutes before air support drove the brigade back into the rocks. By the time the medevac chopper arrived for Del Campo, Jimmy was still sitting with his back against the tire, his hands gradually stopping their tremor. Williams crouched next to him, checked his vest. "You need to get checked out." "That impact, I'm fine." "Hayes, I said I'm fine." Jimmy looked at him. "Is Del Campo gonna make it?" "Because of you?" "Yeah, he's gonna make it." Williams clapped his shoulder. "That was the craziest thing I've ever seen. And I've seen some shit." Jimmy nodded, couldn't trust himself to speak. Inside, something was shifting, reshaping. The darkness was still there. It would always be there. But today it hadn't won. Today he'd been stronger. That night in the mess hall, Davis was retelling the story for the third time. And Hayes just jumps up like he's taking a morning jog. Bullets everywhere. Just strolls over and grabs Del Campo like he's picking up groceries. "It wasn't like that," Jimmy muttered. "The hell it wasn't. You got a death wish or something, Hayes." The old trigger started to fire. "Death wish. Yes, you have no idea how much." But Jimmy pushed through it. He looked at Davis, really looked at him. Saw the grin, the respect in his eyes. This wasn't mockery. This was how these men showed love. "Says the guy who tried to kick in that door last week and nearly broke his foot," Jimmy said. Davis's eyes widened slightly. Jimmy never bantered back. "That door was reinforced." Davis protested. "It was cardboard. You just kick like a toddler." The table erupted in laughter. Del Campo, leg bandaged, raised his water bottle. "Holy shit, Hayes' jokes." "Yeah, well, someone's got to keep Davis humble. Though with those ears, I don't know how he even fits his helmet on." More laughter. Davis grinned, grabbed his own ears. "Satellite dishes, baby. I can hear the enemy coming from a mile away. You can hear them laughing at your aim. Anyway." Jimmy shot back. It felt strange, this lightness. Like a language he'd forgotten he knew. The child in him waited for the punishment, for the mockery to turn mean, for the rejection. But it didn't come. Davis just laughed harder, and Williams threw a roll at both of them, and Del Campo said, "Damn, Hayes, you saved my life and discover comedy in one day." Jimmy felt something unodd in his chest. This was male bonding. This was safety. Not the silence of being overlooked, but the noise of being included. The teasing wasn't the same as the mockery from his childhood. His brothers and sister had pushed down at him because they were fighting for scraps of attention themselves. His parents had been too exhausted to notice the difference. But here, this was different. This was men who'd bleed for each other, finding joy in the spaces between the bullets. All right, Jimmy said, grinning despite himself. "Davis's ears are off limits. They're a tactical asset." "Damn right they are," Davis said. "Unlike your map reading." The old trigger sparked. "You're not good enough." But Jimmy breathed through it. "Just words. Just noise. Not a judgment on his worth." "Fair point," Jimmy said. "But at least I can count past 10 without taking my boots off." The table lost it completely. Later, in his bunk, Jimmy pulled out the card. The mantra had worked. Not because it convinced him he wasn't damaged, but because it gave him something to hold on to when the darkness tried to pull him under. He rewrote it. "I was hurt, and I carry it. I learned I was worthless, but I'm learning different. I am damaged, and I am more than my damage. I take control where I can. I push through when I must. I am becoming the man I choose to be." The war would continue. The anti-fascist brigade would keep fighting, everyone certain they were righteous. Inside, Jimmy's war would continue too. The flashbacks, the triggers, the darkness that whispered he should disappear. But today he'd pushed through it. Today he'd saved a life. Today he'd laughed with men who saw him, even if he was still learning to believe he was worth seeing. His mother wouldn't understand. Might never understand. That was her wound, not his to heal. His father had passed along what he'd been given, granted strength and emotional silence. But Jimmy could choose differently. He closed his eyes, Thought about Del Campo alive because he'd moved, about Davis's laughter, about the way the darkness had loosened its grip just enough. Not healed, not whole, but fighting. And for today, that was enough.